His nudes and portraits are now among the most popular works of art. Amedeo Modigliani's paintings are highly prized. His angel face, his life of misery, his immoderate taste for alcohol and drugs, and his death at age 35 have made him a legend. The last of the damned painters led an authentic bohemian life. He was probably the last true bohemian.
He wanted to live from his art. That is why we can say that he was the last bohemian. He refused to reduce himself to making money in order to live.
Chaïm Soutine, Russian immigrant painter in Paris, was far from having achieved the same fame. His paintings shocked and shook people, and yet in North America, he is considered to be an artistic prophet. Pollock, de Kooning, and Bacon all claim to be his successors.
There might not even have been American abstract expressionism as we know it if Soutine had not existed.
We continue to underestimate Soutine with regard to his importance in the 20th century.
When they met in 1915 in Paris in the middle of the war, everything appeared to separate them. What could they have had in common? Modigliani, the Italian prince of Montparnasse, irresistibly handsome and charming, loved by women, reciting verses by Dante and carrying around with him Lautréamont's songs of Maldoror, and then Chaïm Soutine, the Slav from the far reaches of Russia, introverted, disheveled, ugly for some, dirty for others, who could barely speak French.
For me, the basis of Soutine and Modigliani's friendship was this intersection between their devotion to art and their way of subordinating everything else to their art, of setting that as a goal, of saying that their art took precedence over everything else.
Side by side, they wrote a unique chapter in the history of modern art, a mysterious, enigmatic chapter. What were the keys to this artistic encounter and this improbable, dazzling friendship that only lasted 5 years? In 1915, Modigliani had been a Parisian by adoption for 8 years already. Soutine had arrived in Paris only 2 years earlier. They had friends in common, including a sculptor who would bring the two of them together.
Soutine would meet Modigliani through Jacques Lipchitz, probably in one of those meetings where Lipchitz introduced Modigliani to Jewish artists. Modigliani was a secular Jew and at the time had no particular claims to make in that regard.
I don't believe he really felt Jewish in Paris. In the end, it was the Ashkenazi tradition of the Russian or Polish artists that caused him to reflect on his identity.
He asked Lipchitz, "Who are these Jewish artists you're telling me about? There's no Jewish art." And Lipchitz told him, "Well, you're mistaken. I'm going to introduce you to people and I'll show you what it's about."
We don't know much about the meeting between Modigliani and Soutine. Suddenly being awestruck probably happened through their discussions. Let's not forget, they both had a base in Jewish tradition. Debate and discussion are both the origin of creation in Jewish thought, and were at the heart of the education of both artists. And this inevitably brought them closer together.
Clearly, they had this origin in common. Texts they both knew, a common culture, that's for sure.
Although they shared the same culture, their origins were very different. Modigliani was born in 1884 in Livorno in Tuscany. He was from a well-to-do, cultured family that went bankrupt. In poor health, suffering from tuberculosis since his teenage years, He was cherished by a mother who early on encouraged him to draw and paint. Soutine, 10 years younger, was born in Smilovici, a small remote village near Minsk in present-day Belarus, very immersed in Jewish culture.
Soutine was born into a large family. His daily living circumstances were very hard and he suffered from hunger as a little boy. One day he was sketching, as he liked to draw, and he drew a rabbi, the village's rabbi. And given that there's a ban in the Torah, that it was prohibited to draw human figures, it was frowned upon by people with very conservative religious practices.
It is said that the village rabbi whom Soutine portrayed had a son, a butcher, and when the son found out what a crime the young artist had committed, he beat him up and left him for dead. As reparation, Soutine's family received financial compensation, which allowed them to send the would-be painter away. He joined the Vilnius School of Fine Arts. 2 years later, he tried his luck in Paris, where he arrived completely broke and with only the address of La Ruche, the Hive, a community of mostly Jewish artists.
At the time, Paris was a refuge for most Jews coming from the East and fleeing the pogroms, the anti-Jewish riots. They were thrilled to find a place that was less anti-Semitic than Romania, Poland, and Russia at the time.
You have to imagine Paris during the First World War. Most men had gone to the front, at least those old enough to fight, and few men remained in Paris, mostly foreigners and those who were ill.
Soutine wanted to enlist and was discharged for health reasons. Modigliani, who was also a little guy, suffered from tuberculosis and was discharged for the same reasons. Most of the others went to the front, some did not return, and those who did come back were often in bad shape.
And I think it was quite difficult to live in this context in Paris. Maybe they were looked down upon. Maybe people thought something like, "You're artists, so what use are you? In addition, you're foreigners."
In front of the Café Roton, there were people who passed by, fists raised, yelling, "Death to the aliens," since they knew there were Jewish artists there. So there was this, but at the same time, there was this tolerance. They let them work. So when Modigliani and Soutine met, both lived in Cité Falguière, though not in the same studio. But in the following months, they moved in together and decided to work together and share the misery they were experiencing at the time. They ate very little, they got no recognition, dealers were not interested in them. It was very cold, and hygiene was absolutely deplorable. Cité Falguière was infested with bugs.
At around 11 p.m. or midnight in the studio, it was here in Cité Falguière. At the time, they had thrown out all of the furniture because it was bug-ridden. And I go in there and see a picture like this. Both laying on the floor, with water trenches. They had made trenches out of water all around so that the bugs could not get through. But the bugs were clever. They would often climb up to the ceiling and drop straight down like parachutists.
Even if Modigliani and Soutine were companions in misery and suffered together from hunger and cold, that might not have been enough to cement their friendship.
I am heavily convinced that Modigliani was the first to realize Soutine's talent. He would be his first sponsor, as we call it today, the first to support him, his godfather, his mentor.
He said to himself, as Modi was a little older, they were about 10 years apart, he said, "This young man is really talented and I can see it, and we must help him."
Modigliani would paint at least 4 portraits of Soutine. In 1915, the year they met, Modigliani did a first portrait of Soutine, very small, but with enormous power. In the pupils, there was a little white spot. It looked like someone very clear-sighted. I don't know, there's something impressive about it. He looked like someone rather young, yes, somewhat, well, yes, very young even. And then, little by little, he gained self-confidence. And that was also because Modigliani widened the framework. There was more room around the model, and the model took up more space, especially in this portrait with the big coat. His hands are on his knees, and he makes a Kabbalistic gesture, which I believe is a blessing.
It was the blessing of the Kohanim. There were the high priests in the Jerusalem temple. That's how Modigliani made Soutine resemble very simply a high priest, a Kohen, an heir to the great Jewish tradition, precisely what Soutine did not want to be. Sure, Soutine was Jewish, undeniably, deeply from his education to his very core, but he would always strive to do art that had little to do with his being Jewish.
The question of Jewish art was, at the time and still today, seriously discussed by critics and art historians. Is there Jewish art? How can we define it? Who are its artists? What are its characteristics? The debate is still going on, but the art world likes to identify eras and to label movements and trends. Soutine, Modigliani, and their contemporaries became the Paris School.
The Paris School is a generic term that doesn't refer to anything precise. It designates a group of painters who lived in Paris at the start of the 20th century, mostly around or just before the First World War. Later on, there were 2 distinct periods. The first was before World War I, and the second was known as the Second Paris School, in which some include Picasso and some don't. That gives you an idea of the difference of opinion. However, the main representatives of the school were generally Ashkenazi Jews who'd come to Paris from Eastern countries. Their styles had little to do with one another, but they would include Soutine, Chagall, and Modigliani, as well as a number of other painters such as Kisling, even though his style of painting didn't have much to do with the artists just mentioned.
These were people who had come to the school of French art, but who were somewhat old school and had a hard time jumping into the middle of things. They remained very attached to figurative art and were relatively unreceptive to surrealism. I would say they didn't understand all aspects of French art.
This attraction they shared for French art and classic art, was it also one of the keys to the mysterious friendship between Soutine and Modigliani?
I think that what also created this friendship was their love for ancient art. They might not have liked the same artists, but perhaps they took walks together in these museums. Perhaps they talked about them, and I think this also created a bond between them.
Soutine's favorite school was the Louvre. He went there often. He loved the paintings of Clouet and especially Rembrandt.
What interested Soutine was Rembrandt. What interested Soutine was Courbet and Corot. His mindset was one of total assimilation.
He became crazy looking at Rembrandt and would start dancing while looking at Rembrandt's portrait. He would dance on the spot, shouting, "It's too beautiful, it's too beautiful, it's incredible." The museum guards must have been taken aback by this odd character.
Soutine was fascinated by the 17th century master. He reinterpreted especially 2 of his paintings, The first was The Slaughtered Ox, based on which he would do a series of 5 paintings beginning in 1925. Then there was one last tribute in 1931, inspired by a woman bathing in a stream. The influence of his friend Modigliani was just as important.
When Modigliani arrived in Paris in 1906, Cézanne was dying. The year after that, in 1907, a great Cézanne retrospective took place at the Independent. It struck Modigliani hard. He was quite stunned by the way Cézanne worked with layers. Quickly afterwards, he began going to the Trocadero Museum, which at the time was a huge fair. It included all kinds of art, what was then called Negro art, including not only African sculpture, but also South Pacific sculpture. They also had Khmer sculpture and other things that made a strong impression on Modigliani.
Modigliani's first means of expression was painting, and yet one day he decided to be a sculptor. He even wanted his address to show that. He was Modigliani, sculptor.
Modigliani was introduced to sculpture by Brancusi, whom he met at the Cité Falguière. He showed Modigliani the basics of sculpture. For Brancusi and for Modigliani, who would take on his point of view, sculpture was the summum of art.
We can see that he found inspiration in Egypt, Africa, Angkor, etc. But we can never say that he copied anything, because what he wanted was a kind of a summary of all this information, of all these sources. This meant combining almond-shaped eyes, that perhaps came from Angkor, with Ivory Coast masks. This was a mix he was interested in.
In 1910, 1911, he had to stop sculpture because he only wanted to work with stone and marble, only noble material. He refused to use clay and to make casts. He felt this produced too much mud, which was not good enough for him. However, as he suffered from tuberculosis, stone and marble dust was destroying him.
He was a bit disappointed to abandon sculpture because he had really thrown himself into it. I believe he really wanted to be a sculptor. So he regretted that period, which we see clearly in his first paintings. They are still very much focused on the head. We see a neck alone floating in a frame. It's quite astonishing.
Little by little, with this sculptural approach of characters and these faces that look like masks, Modigliani developed his style, a very distinctive style, cut off from the world and full of melancholy. And at his side, Soutine was also paving his own way.
At first, he took themes from his poverty, from his everyday life. It was often still lifes with animals. For instance, a still life with herrings, as that was all he had to eat.
The composition is extremely simple, almost simplistic. It is a plate, 3 herrings lined up. There are no effects, no light, no decoration. And there is something very violent in this somewhere. And this way of painting that is almost primitive, that is distinctive of his style.
We're in a state in between the first original violence, that's the murder of the animal, and the second one, which is the preparation and transformation into food. Soutine is exactly in this in-between. That is what he's painting, what was slaughtered and could be eaten, and of which he will deprive himself for artistic reasons.
Modigliani and Soutine worked very hard all day long in their little Montparnasse studio. But come the evening, they would go from bar to forget their lives of misery in wild nights out.
In pre-war years, there was the Butte Montmartre. And then during the First War and in the interwar period, Montparnasse really became the center of the world in a wider and more cosmopolitan way than Montmartre. In Montparnasse, everyone made the scene.
At the cafe terraces, the painters were there. Picasso, Matisse, Fujita, Kisling, and the poets Apollinaire, Cocteau, and well-known models such as the famous Kiki of Montparnasse. It was a happy cast of characters having endless discussions every night and drinking joyfully.
Modigliani and Soutine mostly went to the Rotonde Cafe. They had many friends there and the owner was extraordinary. His name was Libion, and he understood right away that when he bought this shoe store and turned it into a cafe, that this would become one of the most famous cafes in the world, because he treated artists properly. What did Libion say to his waiters? These people, Soutine, Modigliani, and the others who don't have much money, he would say to them, they can have a drink, but don't ask them to order another. They can stay as long as they want. So this gentleman's generosity allowed these artists to eat, or rather drink a lot, to stay warm and to have a friendly place and exhibit their paintings, as these artists would often hang in the Café Rotonde the paintings they were unable to sell. Modigliani was very outgoing. He would sit at the terrace and make drawings for 1 franc so he could afford to drink. Soutine would sit alone and watch him. We often get this idea of a sad, melancholic Soutine, yet both shared many laughs and drank a lot. Once, Soutine confessed to having drunk so much that he'd walked around the Rotonde without ever finding the entrance, so he must have been quite drunk.
When they were really hungry, the artists would also meet at the Impasse du Chemin du Montparnasse, a small alley lined with studios. The place is still intact today.
There was this Russian artist who just arrived in Paris and whose name was Mary Vassiliev. The First World War had just begun, and Mary Vassiliev decided something should be done to help these starving artists. But what? In her studio, she decided to set up a canteen for artists. For a very small amount of money, they could get a warm meal, and for a little extra, they would get a glass of wine. And so they could party all night.
Soutine and Modigliani would not only party, their long drunken nights were also an opportunity for lively discussions about their dreams and their visions of art.
Modigliani and Soutine's painting had something in common, the art of the portrait. And the portrait to them was about bringing out the soul. That is what interested them. These things that came from humans, this poetic aspect, the soul.
One showed the soul through beauty, and the other through ugliness. So their approaches were opposite one another, but the search was the same. That was what brought them together.
With Modigliani, this search for the soul came out in his style, through aesthetics. It translated into lascivious postures and into pure lines and shapes. It is not Modigliani who distorted and stretched out the faces. It is not he who brought out the irregularities, put out their eyes, stretched out their necks. Everything took place in his heart. His drawing is a silent conversation, a dialogue between his brushstrokes and his being. Jean Cocteau.
There was always a kind of halo around Modigliani's portraits. The light came from within, like the portrait of Soutine, in which the character produced light. And sometimes there was no light, which is very interesting, as it meant that the character gave off nothing.
In a young, dark-haired girl seated, which belonged to Picasso, we see he created a sort of halo around her face, so we are drawn to her look. With Soutine, we never really know where we access the painting. Actually, we zigzag in it, through the colorful strokes, the range of colors. It feels like it is vibrating in all directions.
When we look at a painting by Soutine, we have a hard time understanding how he did it. How can you make something so beautiful with such ugliness? It is always deeply unsettling. He played on shock, on violence.
It is true that there is a very repulsive side, but it is part of the character. It's very beautiful also. If you look at certain parts of Soutine's paintings, it's very beautiful. It's painting. It's done with a great deal of intertwined little brushstrokes here and there, with alterations. It's really something when you look at it. It's really a painter's painting.
When examined carefully, Soutine does not simply make his models ugly. He distorts them, makes them look older, sometimes more than 50 years older, even when they are children or teenagers.
There is this anecdote about Paulette Jourdan, which I personally experienced. I had seen the portrait of Paulette Jourdan by Soutine. It is a portrait that was made when Paulette was about 20 years old. When I knocked on Paulette Jourdan's door, it was striking for me to see that the person who opened the door looked exactly like the portrait. So when Soutine painted her at age 20 or 25, he anticipated the age she would have. When I saw her, she was 85 or 82 years old.
Modigliani used to say that Soutine painted subjects in such a way that the model would later look like the painting.
In a few cases, Modigliani and Soutine used the same model.
There was this Russian sculptor, Oscar Metschaninov, who was in Paris during this period. Modigliani did a portrait of him in 1917 or 18, and later, after Modigliani had died, Soutine would also do a portrait of Metschaninov.
So, what do we see in Soutine's Metschaninov? We see Soutine. Modigliani paints more of the face. This one is much more static, much clearer, much colder. But it isn't the same technique either. Modigliani's brushstroke is more pronounced, while Soutine's brushstroke is much more chaotic. There is something more alive and more visceral in Soutine than in Modigliani, who is much more like the painter Ingres in a way.
In 1916, while Soutine was struggling for recognition, Modigliani exhibited 15 of his paintings next to those of Matisse, Kiesling, and Picasso in the Lyre and Palette Salon. It was a breeding ground for avant-garde creation that had been created by painter Émile Lejeune in his own little studio. Leon Zubrowski, a young Russian immigrant and novice dealer of etchings, went there looking for young talent and was stunned by Modigliani's work.
Zubrowski was in awe. He went to the Rotonde to join his wife and a friend and told them, "I just saw a painter who is worth 10 times more than Picasso. It's amazing." He then organized a meeting with Modigliani and proposed the deal. He would give him a regular income, and Modigliani would give him all of his paintings. He would find him a studio and models. He would give him everything. What better deal for Modigliani, who committed to give him his paintings, which he was not selling anyway?
On Zubrowski's advice, Modigliani started painting female nudes. These paintings would be exhibited in his first and only retrospective that took place while he was still alive in 1917 in the Berthe Weil Gallery.
Modigliani painted many more portraits than nudes, but obviously the nudes had been showcased because nudes were scandalous. It might not have been an innocent move on Zubrowski's part. Maybe he wanted to attract people with a scandal, but the paintings didn't get sold precisely because they were too alive. When you examine how he did the skin, his brush really caressed the canvas, as if a piece of the canvas remained on the brush, and the skin gave off light. The women were real.
Modigliani was a very generous man. When he realized how lucky he was to be working with Zubrowski, who was devoted to him, he decided to share his luck with his young friend Soutine. He introduced him to Zubrowski, but Soutine and Zubrowski did not click, as it had with Modigliani. And it went even worse with Zubrowski's wife, who was a bit anti-Semitic. So with Modigliani's elegance, it could work, but with this one, a bit of a drunk, not very clean, rude, it would not.
Legend has it that in order to take him to dinner at the Zubrowskis, Modigliani took charge of Soutine's education and tried to teach him some manners. Sit up straight, eat with a fork, and especially stop wiping your nose on your clothes.
There was a lovely anecdote about a night when they were finishing dinner. Soutine was not done eating, but Modigliani was finished and told him, "Don't move, I'm going to draw a portrait of you." And on a door inside the apartment, he drew a portrait of his friend Soutine. Zubrowski said, "What have you done? What are we going to do with this?" Modigliani said, "Well, in a few years, this door will be worth gold," which was true. But the wife said, "Well, in the meantime, we'll be forced to live with this." implying, as she'd said already, this dirty Jew in his portrait. Modigliani knew exactly what he was doing and managed to force Soutine on people who didn't want him.
Although he was reluctant to do so, faced with Modigliani's insistence, Zubrowski took Soutine under his wing. In the spring of 1918, the war was raging in Paris. The capital was under siege and was being bombarded by long-range German cannons, which the French nicknamed Big Bertha. There was heavy human and material damage. To protect his two protégés, Zubrowski sent them to the south of France, to Cagnes-sur-Mer and Nice.
It did Modigliani a lot of good to breathe the air of southern France. The sun was very good for his health and his lungs. As for Soutine, at first he was a bit confused and couldn't sit still, so he went for walks. Around Chaïm, he did outdoor paintings. He painted the wind. He painted the trees tormented by the wind. He is a painter who made the wind visible, who managed to make it sing. He would paint these shaking landscapes. He captured the war's convulsions with color and twists. He didn't paint the war, he showed something else. He showed that the earth itself was shaking.
To me, these are Soutine's masterpieces, these landscapes that twist and turn and knock us out, where everything collapses in every direction. There is extraordinary violence and emotion in these landscapes.
Soutine's landscapes are not innocent. They are not about a joyful countryside. Although it can be funny, it's tormented, it's complicated, but it makes you think. It makes you reflect, and that can make you dizzy. Modigliani worked on vertigo differently. He worked on inner vertigo, through the emptiness of the eyes and through expressions that were sometimes totally calm. With Soutine, subjects took on convulsive shapes, while with Modigliani, they would appear more even-tempered. Each managed to relate to the other in this because they started out at the same point.
Soutine always sought to take charge of the painting material. He did not do drawings first, so he painted directly.
You know, before anything else, and this is the basis of any explanation, Soutine lived only for his painting. And seeing him paint was like watching the phenomenon of creation. He was possessed, and all life around him had to stop. The children, gardeners, servants, and animals disappeared. The model or landscape alone existed. A glance, a brushstroke, a glance, a brushstroke. And thus was his creation of life.
In southern France, Modigliani and Soutine did not live together. Modigliani was living with his young partner, the painter Jeanne Hébuterne, who was pregnant with their daughter. Soutine would go to paint alone for days in the countryside, like a wild man. Modigliani was not as inspired.
What mattered was the portraits, so surely it was at Swarovski's request that he painted a few landscapes.
He did 4 of them and 2 sketches to prepare for these 4 paintings. It did not interest him.
One night, Modigliani got in a heated argument with Diego Rivera at the Rotonde. Rivera was saying that landscape painting exists, and Modigliani said that it did not exist. Picasso was here with his cane watching, a bit stunned, as the two fought. Yet landscapes were not Modigliani's main concern.
There was another element in the landscapes when he did the portrait of Roger Dutilleul. He entered Dutilleul's apartment and saw all the artwork that he had collected, especially Cubist landscape paintings by Braque and Picasso. He reportedly told Dutilleul, "I am 10 years behind them."
Although Modigliani turned away from landscapes, he remained sensitive to the sun of southern France.
His painting changed simply because the light was different, and so his palette became lighter in color. There had been more brown tones, dark tones, but then it became about soft greens, pinks, and even rather luminous oranges. Surely he also found there the light of his native Italy.
At the end of May 1919, Modigliani went back to Paris with his partner and 6-month-old daughter, also named Jeanne. Soutine went to Serres, a small village in the eastern Pyrenees that attracted many painters. In Paris, Modigliani's health deteriorated quickly. On January 22, 1920, the neighbors found him agonizing in his bed, next to Jeanne Hébuterne, who was again almost 9 months pregnant. Suffering from tubercular meningitis, he was taken to the hospital where he died 2 days later. He was only 35 years old. The entire artistic community was in shock. His friend, composer Georges Auric, followed the funeral procession and described it.
There really was a funeral for a prince of painting. And behind that coffin, there was all of Montparnasse, all those people. And that day, you see, I felt that something was beginning. And that really, it was Modigliani's glory. And that day, the sun rose on him at the same time as his coffin when we arrived at Père Lachaise Cemetery. When Modigliani died in January 1920, it really was the end of the bohemian era. It was over. The true bohemian died with Modigliani. The First World War did the job, and one of the few survivors of this bohemian art of living was Modigliani. The others had died or were crippled in the war, or they made a fortune somehow, but they would not live bohemian life the way he did.
It was a shock. Made worse 2 days later when his partner jumped out of a window and killed herself out of love. That is when the legend was born. Alcohol, tobacco, drugs, etc. All of this was an experience to reach images, worlds, visions. It was an artistic path to take. It was typical. So yes, he drank, but was he an alcoholic to the point that it would kill him? No, that is false.
I think the misunderstanding as to Modigliani's paintings and sculpture is that we try to superimpose his life on his artwork. We absolutely want to find the sick man in his work, his tragic life, his misery, and so on.
It was said that on his deathbed, Modigliani made Zborowski promise to take care of Soutine and told him, "Don't worry, I'm leaving, but I'm leaving you, Soutine."
I think that he recognized in Soutine something quite astounding. We don't meet everyday artists with this kind of talent. So he felt that he had met an artist of genius, a natural. And that is probably what impressed him. Try to imagine how we can do somebody's portrait with oil paint without doing a drawing first. You would have to be quite good.
When Modigliani passed away, Soutine lost his most faithful friend as well as his most precious supporter.
It's very simple. The moment Modigliani disappeared, Zborowski had only one preoccupation: to get rid of Soutine, which he had never done as long as Modigliani was alive. As soon as Modigliani died, he sent him to Céret, where he was so unhappy that he tried to kill himself.
At the moment of Modigliani's death, we don't have much information about Soutine's reaction. We know that he went through it with a mix of deep sadness and sometimes ungratefulness. He resented him for teaching him to get drunk. But I think that deep down he maintained a deep love for the only person who was able to give him immediate recognition. And he said little aggressive sentences to reassure himself, to tell himself, deep down, I am strong. I have to stay on course. The course we set together, each in our art, to go as far as possible, without compromise, without ever kneeling down to the dealers.
One of the paradoxes of this improbable friendship was that while Modigliani painted several portraits of Soutine, Soutine never painted Modigliani. Was he refusing to make him ugly? Did Modigliani refuse to pose for anyone other than his partner? We also only know about a few rare self-portraits of him. Without Modigliani, Soutine survived only with the 5 francs that Zborowski gave him every day, with the value of less than €5 today. He hung out between Paris, Cagnes, and mostly Céret, which was a turning point in his painting. But an unplanned event disrupted his life and his career. In 1922, American billionaire Albert Barnes, who had made a fortune in the pharmaceutical industry, came to Paris to put together a collection of contemporary artwork for his foundation in Philadelphia. It is said that when he saw Le Petit Pâtissier, the little pastry chef, in the window of an art dealer, Paul Guillaume, he had such a shock that he asked Paul Guillaume and Zborowski to find as many Soutine paintings as possible and bought 50 of them immediately.
Barnes was an unexpected savior. He was the billionaire, the equivalent of Bill Gates. He made Paul Guillaume rich, he made Zborowski rich, and he made Soutine rich.
From one day to the next, Soutine became the idol of Paris's in-crowd and of the art market. He would never be needy again for the rest of his life.
Soutine's fate was sealed. He was selling paintings and making a lot of money. The first thing he did was buy a nice suit and a car.
Despite his fame and success, during the Second World War, Soutine once again experienced fear and loneliness. His health deteriorated. He took refuge in the Indre and Loire region to escape the Nazi regime. On August 7, 1943, he was taken to the emergency room as his ulcer was worsening, but it was too late. The problem had already degenerated into cancer. He died 2 days later. Only Picasso, Cocteau, Max Jacob, and a few old friends attended his funeral at the Montparnasse cemetery. He was buried discreetly in his partner's vault. Nothing was engraved on his tombstone before the end of the war, and his name was forgotten.
I think that art history has been a bit unfair to Soutine. Art historians have always been a bit wary of his upheavals, of his untouchable uniqueness.
We now realize that he was one of the leading lights of the Paris school, one of the indisputable masters with his highly charged originality.
Modigliani was more successful afterwards, but I think the soft melancholy of certain Modigliani paintings and the sensuality of others have made him more acceptable. But I find it's a shame that Soutine was left aside and neglected, because I believe that at times he was simply misunderstood.
Modigliani and Soutine, the last two Bohemian painters of Montparnasse, left behind them the mark of their unprecedented originality. Nothing resembles a Modigliani painting, and nothing else resembles a Soutine. Their intense friendship lasted only 5 years. 5 years of sharing a life of damned artists, of poverty, of debauchery, but more than anything, of overflowing creative energy and common beliefs.
Your duty is never to lose yourself in sacrifice. Your true duty is to preserve your dreams. Modigliani.